The suffrage movement as we know today is often given a beginning at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. This was the first large-scale organized event where women could gather together and collectively agree to the basic tenets of the movement, then and in the future. They ultimately decided on what they called a Declaration of Sentiments. This was a pivotal moment in the movement's history, but it certainly wasn't the beginning. The following conversation between mother and daughter will help to shed light on the suffrage fight up to the turn of the century. The story of women in this country and in your family goes back nearly 200 years. The first European women who came here had very little in the way of rights. The Native American women had held positions of esteem and leadership within the tribal system, but colonial women were governed by colonial laws, and they didn't seem to value a woman's abilities. As a child, a girl was controlled and protected by her father. As soon as she got married, all of her property became her husband's, though, and this included her children. If a woman found herself in an abusive marriage and decided to leave, she left with only the clothes on her back. She left all of her belongings, her home, her wealth, and her children. Under law, these things belonged to her husband. There was one time when she was free, before she got married, and if she became widowed. Then she could own property, write wills, enter into contracts. The list goes on and on. But as soon as she got married, it was gone. Like with most things, there were small exceptions to the rule, but this was the experience for most white women in the United States.
Just the white women?
The African American experience in this country is complicated and overwhelming. It deserves more than a footnote in this conversation. So I'll just say this. White women found themselves without rights to themselves, their property, and their children, and in a very small way, it opened their eyes to the horrible experience of enslaved people in this country. So many women from all walks of life began to speak out against slavery. They picked up the banner of abolition and raised their voices to be heard. They were passionate about seeing change in this country. They believed that people had the potential to be better versions of themselves, and that meant doing away with institutions like slavery and the support of drinking liquor. Liquor had led to so much violence and family decline. These abolition and temperance supporters began speaking out publicly. These women began to make a scene. Elizabeth Cady Stanton traveled to London for a suffrage conference, but she was forced to sit in the balcony. She couldn't vote, so she wasn't worth much in their eyes. She and others realized that if they were going to change anything, they must be considered valuable voters. Until they got that, they were forgettable. Once she got home to the U.S., she and Susan B. Anthony began to formulate a plan for the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, this is where most people think suffrage begins, but I know, and now you know, that suffrage was brewing long before then. Seneca Falls, New York was really the first opportunity for women to gather together, united in this cause. They came up with a list of expectations called the Declaration of Sentiments. They drafted 12 resolutions for the future of the women's rights movement. They wanted rights to their property, rights to their children, the right to leave an abusive or dangerous marriage, and so on. But you know what very nearly didn't make the list?
What?
The right for women to vote.
Why? I thought that was all they wanted.
Actually, there were very few that thought adding the right to vote was a good thing. They thought if they pushed for the vote, that would give their opponents more than enough reason to kill the whole plan. There was even heated debate about whether it might give men the right to take over in the home, and for many, that sounded absolutely terrifying. However, it did make the list, and over the next few years, multiple large gatherings would host fascinating speakers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and hundreds of others. Until the war.
What happened then?
Well, with the country tearing itself apart at the seams, pushing for equal rights was set on the back burner. As soon as the war ended, Mrs. Stanton and Mrs. Anthony reignited the fire. They formed the Equal Rights Organization for everyone. Women, men, white and black. They continued to push for equal rights and abolition. When the 14th and 15th Amendments made their way through government, suffragists just assumed that it would be a natural progression, that the right to vote would be given to everyone, regardless of race or sex. So when the 15th Amendment was passed, giving the right only to black men, Many suffragists were upset. They felt that they had fought for years side by side for both rights movements, abolition and suffrage, and now abolition had won and suffrage had been left in the cold. Suffrage supporters split at this point. Some believed that women had made strides within individual state governments. They believed that the path to suffrage led through the states. The other half believed that the only way to ensure equality for everyone was to change the law of the land, the Constitution. Multiple well-known women pushed the boundaries in an effort to establish precedent, meaning that if they could get away with voting once, others might be able to do it as well, with the "but she did it first" defense. Susan B. Anthony even went to jail for it.
Really? What happened?
Oh my, well that's a story for another day, my love. Get some rest and I'll tell you more in the morning.
Okay, good night, Mother.
The fight for women's right to vote gained significant momentum after the turn of the 20th century. The movement saw a split between suffragists, who believed in peaceful and persuasive reform, and suffragettes, who embraced a more militant and aggressive tactic. These two ideologies split not only the suffrage supporters, but in many cases, generations who had previously fought side by side. In 1919, the amendment granting women the right to vote had been passed, but there was still much work to do. The same mother and daughter, now older and slightly wiser, have come together again to discuss their differences.
Hello, Mother. I know you and Father were shocked to hear that I had been detained, and I certainly appreciate you arranging my release, as well as affording me the opportunity to explain myself. The women's suffrage movement of yours and my grandmother's generation fought ardently to forge the way for future women to have a level of equality that you could only have dreamed of. In the same spirit, the women of my generation are dedicated to carrying the torch until we can stand shoulder to shoulder with men as we cast our votes for our government officials. New leaders in the movement, dynamic women like Alice Paul, Harriet Stanton Blatch, the Pankhurst ladies in the UK, these ladies have come to understand that the movement has lain dormant for years, and we need to stand up, shake the dust loose, and prove that we women have the courage to take bold action in order to effect change, in order to show men that we have just as much resolve as they do.
Standing up and demanding to be heard is one thing, my dear. What you are doing is terrorizing the innocent population. Acid bombs, arson, lighting mailboxes on fire, staging pickets outside the White House even. These types of inflammatory actions will certainly do more damage to our cause. How can we attempt to claim that we approach politics and government with level-headed decision-making when you and your friends are causing fear among all levels of society?
We want to incite change at every level. You ladies tend to focus on the upper and the middle class white women, but we realize that if we're going to see the 19th Amendment, the lower classes must march with us. Do you recall the tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911? 600 women packed into the top floors of a tragically underprotected factory. It would have taken hours for all of those workers to descend the 2 single stairways to the ground, only to find that the doors were locked from the outside. These young women burned to death while trying to escape. Some were crushed by falling elevators, and the owners? These men had already had 2 claims paid out to them for 2 other factory fires. It was never so obvious that the lives of women were expendable, especially lower-class women, than inside that factory.
And yet, on Titanic, women and children were given the first seats on the lifeboats. So perhaps they weren't so expendable. Consider the women's suffrage parade. I think it was May 1913, before Wilson's inauguration, back when our groups were not fractured between suffragists and suffragettes, between peaceful dialogue and militant and terrifying attacks. That parade was lovely. 8,000 ladies of multiple, diverse backgrounds, led by the beautiful Inez Mulholland on a white horse, like Joan of Arc.
That lovely parade wasn't the utopia you claim, Mother. I was there marching. I remember the jeers and the taunts. I remember passing too close to the crowd and feeling a random punch in the stomach and ribs. My friends were spit on, and the War Department decided we were a danger and must be controlled. The only benefit that day was that the front of our parade was collapsed and the women of color who'd been marching in the back were able to make their way forward and proudly march up front. But as we watched our ranks be aggressively attacked, it became clearer and clearer that not only must we not lose our nerve and stop our own aggressive actions, but we needed to go straight to the top for support. A great war was raging against tyranny and for freedom, and we just feel that the president should be a natural supporter of that vote. I'm honored to be one of the very first to protest in front of the president's home. So many lovely supporters came out, and some less supportive, like the politicians who called us iron-jawed angels and tried to make us seem unstable.
Yes, dear. And how did that work out for you and your ilk? Ah, yes. You were rounded up and detained.
And it all culminated in the night of terror, when Superintendent Whitaker ordered his guards to brutalize us. We were dragged, beaten, choked, kicked, some even force-fed with tubes down into their stomachs. Newspapers exploded the sensational story, and then people were interested.
That's certainly true. In January the following year, Wilson announces his support. Next day, the House narrowly passes the 19th Amendment, but the Senate refuses to even debate until October. Fails by 2 votes. However, the National Women's Party, ever encouraging suffrage focus on the state and local level, encourages people to vote against anti-suffragists, leaving Congress mostly pro-suffrage.
And finally, in May of 1919, the House passed the amendment, and 2 weeks later, the Senate did as well. But we still have such a long way to go.
By the 1930s, things had changed significantly for a wide range of women and their struggles. Generations that had fought so ardently for women's rights had long since passed on and left the younger generation to carry the torch and enjoy new freedoms that the suffrage movement had given rise to. Passing of the 19th Amendment was in many ways just the beginning of a new fight towards suffrage. 3/4 of state legislatures still needed to vote in favor of the ratification to officially make the amendment a law. The Women's Suffrage Amendment, written by Susan B. Anthony and introduced to Congress in 1878, was finally passed in 1919, and with Tennessee as the 36th state, the 19th Amendment is certified as law. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the basis of sex. It sounds fairly simple, but actually, the Tennessee vote almost didn't happen. Harry Byrne, just 24 years old, and the youngest member of the state legislature, was a self-proclaimed anti-suffragist. He even wore the rose of anti-suffrage on his lapel the day of the historic vote. But fate appears to have stepped in that morning, because before he left for the vote, a letter arrived that would change the course of history. The author of that very important note? Harry's mom. She begged him to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. Harry wore his anti-suffrage rose and carried his mother's note with him when he stood among his fellow legislators for the vote. And when he shouted aye in favor of passing women's suffrage, the crowd of fellow legislators were shocked. Before that moment, they all had little doubt as to how the young man would vote. But with one word, he ensured that the Constitution would be forever changed. The next day, he met with members of the press who were desperate to know what had happened. He said, "I know that a mother's advice is always safest for her boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification." The historic vote arrived by train to Washington, D.C., and Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby made sure that the document was secretly transported to his personal home. At 8 a.m., he signed and certified the ratification, alone. The generations of women who had fought for this moment were waiting with anticipation, were completely excluded from witnessing that historic moment. This should have been a moment of foreshadowing, as it certainly reflected a significant attitude towards women actually voting. Many women who attempted to vote that November found that while the law said they could, there were many people who were hell-bent on making it difficult, if not impossible. Anti-suffragists claimed that women would compromise their moral standing or desert their traditional roles completely as they became involved in public affairs. Others claimed they simply didn't have the staff to handle the influx of women voters. And what if, God forbid, they topple the whole system with their wild voting? In an effort to stem the tide, many states began to blockade in alternative ways. They put complicated residency rules into place.
They leaned on the strange loophole that stripped women of their U.S. citizenship if they married a foreign national. Many required a poll tax that lower-income families simply couldn't afford to double for both spouses. Some places got even more creative. Philadelphia, for example, required women provide their age before voting, which they saw as a horrifying invasion, and that was enough to dissuade many. While these barriers to voting didn't directly violate the 19th Amendment, they certainly made voting more difficult for all women who attempted. Perhaps no group was more ardently worked against than African American women. While generations of suffragists came from diverse backgrounds, and leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and many others worked alongside lesser acknowledged but equally influential leaders like Marie Louise Baldwin, Nina Otero Warren, Mary Ann Carey, and Frances Harper, these women are largely forgotten. Their fight reflected their passion for the vote, but also the importance of a broader struggle faced by their individual communities, basic human and civil rights. Even after the ratification of the 19th, they would face blockades to their voting designed to alienate them specifically. Many states required literacy or educational tests. They were required to pay significant poll taxes. They were blocked by outright fraud, and some simply by intimidation or violence. While these tactics were effective in many areas, the voices of leaders like Mary Ann Carey and Frances Harper continued to inspire courage and determination. Both of these ladies had been raised by parents who provided safe haven for many on the Underground Railroad, clearly setting the example that there were some things that were simply worth risking everything for. These women continued to fight for equal pay, job training, childcare options, and educational opportunities for African American women. Asian American immigrants also found themselves unable to stand and be counted after the ratification due to the ineligibility for naturalized citizenship. In fact, they wouldn't gain the right to vote until 1943. Despite that, Dr. Mabel Lee was considered a brilliant speaker and was even asked to ride at the head of the 1912 suffrage parade in New York City. Her excellence was recognized even then at the age of 16. Native American women also found themselves outside of the voting sphere. Many were not made citizens until 1924, and even then, in some states, they remained classified as wards of the state and weren't granted the right to vote until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Gertrude Simmons Bonin of the Yankton Sioux had been a prominent and dynamic member of the suffrage community and opened up yet another perspective for discussion and attention. She spoke of the importance of gaining not only national citizenship, but also recognition for their tribal citizenship. They saw suffrage as the path to protecting their lands and their communities. Now, ultimately, the suffrage movement may have been a women's movement, but it also highlighted the vastly diverse communities that all called themselves women. However, hopefully beyond the diversity and the complexities of the individual, you're beginning to see that there were many common goals. You see, the 19th Amendment didn't give anyone the right to vote. At best, it signaled a victory in the battle for the rights of women. Generations of women from all walks of life took up the mantle of equality and faced decades of resistance. Their courage, perseverance, resilience, and collaboration should never be minimized. The right to vote should not be taken lightly, as each vote cast stands as a tribute to them.